I'm excited to introduce you to an incredible person that I said many of you already know, Dr. Deb Sandella. And Dr. Deb, as you remember, is the founder of the RIM Institute and the best-selling author of Goodbye, Hurt, and Pain, 7 Simple Steps to Health, Love, and Success. She's also an award-winning psychotherapist and the originator of the groundbreaking Regenerating Images in Memory method, which we call the RIM method, which is proven neuroscience tool that helps people process emotional wounds and dissolve subconscious blocks. Many of you have probably worked with Dr. Deb and had that experience. I know I have, and it's been very profound for me. And Dr. Deb is one of the most powerful and effective emotional healers that I know. So Dr. Deb, welcome.
Thank you, Jack. It's great to be here.
Well, it's great to have you here. You know, what we've come here to talk about today is trauma and how to recognize the signals when it's there and how to respond effectively to trauma. 90% of maybe 95% of what's stopping us in life is trauma. And sometimes it's really intense trauma, like sexual abuse and physical abuse. Sometimes it's just little things that happen where we may have made a decision about ourselves from that traumatic moment that's blocking us. I know, Dr. Deb, you've called trauma a hidden saboteur that prevents people from achieving success. Can you start by explaining what you mean by that?
Sure. Thanks for asking, Jack. Yes, because trauma, as you've mentioned, is having an experience of a very stressful event. And the range of what that kind of event can be, as you identify, can be very innocuous to extremely unforgettable. And so, what happens though with trauma, it's like having a moment in our lives go on pause. Like in the video, the Inner Mind video, there's this one moment that freezes. And once it's frozen, it's the moment that is most terrifying, not consciously, but emotionally in the body, and it gets frozen. So then we keep living our lives, we forget all about it, but it's still there. And so that's what we'll be talking a lot more about today, is how that works and how we can work with it, really.
So how does trauma lead to self-destructive thoughts and behaviors? I mean, we've all experienced it. You have this traumatic moment in time, and then it moves into these beliefs. Sometimes they go underground. We don't even know we have them anymore. Behaviors that are unconscious. What's the dynamic of that?
Well, one of the things that happens that's really powerful when there's a traumatic moment is a very sudden feeling of helplessness, that we cannot, that we're somehow in danger, whether that's emotional or physical, and that we don't have the power to be able to protect ourselves or those we love. I mean, it's the same in that situation. So, in that moment, helplessness, the framework of helplessness freezes on the screen of the unconscious mind. So it's like having, a screensaver on your computer. It's there all the time in the background. So when we look at the world, we are looking through that helpless, terrifying feeling in the way, however, that image is presenting. And then other people looking at us and they're looking at that screensaver unconsciously. They sense it. They may not see it directly because it's not known, but it's the background. All of a sudden it becomes the background of everything we're doing. So we're not feeling so comfortable taking risks, stepping out of our comfort zone. So that really has a big impact on how quickly and whether we grow, whether we become more successful. As you know, you have always made the point about risk taking, how important that is to grow, that expanding our comfort zone, stepping out of our comfort zone is just so important.
Yeah, I think about some of my own traumas that I've overcome over the years and through your work and my own work. And the term you just said that feels really powerful to kind of just slam me in the face was helplessness.
Mm-hmm.
That when I think about the times I had traumatic experiences, especially as a young child, like being not measuring up to some expectation my dad had, and then him getting really angry. And then I felt like, oh, like, I don't know how to survive this. Like that didn't work. That's what my natural response was. I don't know what else to do. And then I was like, oh, wow, this is like scary. It feels very
Right.
dangerous.
That's exactly right. It's all of a sudden that scariness now starts to become a limitation to, how we see ourselves and what's possible for ourselves. So it's very significant, very significant.
So a lot, as I said earlier, a lot of us have these unresolved traumas. We don't know it. So what I want to talk about with you today is how do we recognize that we're working with people? It's one thing where someone they're ignorant, they don't know what to do. There's these success principles, there are strategies, and
Right.
yet they're stuck. They're not doing them because of the trauma. And how do we help people know when someone's now stuck in a traumatic space? And then how do we deal with that? That's what I really want to explore with you. So let's start that conversation.
Yeah, and I just want to mention that a lot of people will not think of themselves as having had a trauma because it seems like, oh, well, that was just a little thing. Or it's one of those things where we have that attitude, well, just get over it, pull yourself
Mhm.
up by the bootstraps. There's that attitude that glosses over that pain that is really very deep. And then we don't inquire. We don't even start looking for trauma. And one of the things that happens is we're very afraid of looking weak and
Mhm.
vulnerable. And so we tend to not want to look like that or sound like that. And so we just kind of push away and, kind of like holding that beach ball under the water. That takes a lot of holding to keep old trauma really silent. Because it's going to show up. And the way that it shows up, and this is getting into answering your question, Jack, the way it shows up is really through triggered behavior. All of a sudden, we're in an experience that somehow, at an unconscious level, frequently reminds us of the same helplessness or the same terror or whatever that experience was for us originally. And now we are in it. We are in it again. And we know this from the neuroscience that when you have a traumatic memory stick and it's still there, it's still operating till it's processed. So we continue to feel like we're in a trauma situation till whatever has been a trauma that is really influencing us has been processed and really sorted out, become aware of, and in RIM we would say dissolved, that the body energy is dissolved, that's the way we dissolve the magnetic power of a stuck traumatic experience.
Mhm.
Otherwise, it attracts more of the same or unconsciously. We're not thinking of it. We don't want to create that. We're trying very hard not to, but it's at an unconscious body level, an energetic level.
Mhm. So before we talk more about how to deal with it when it shows up, something I learned recently too is there's something called intergenerational trauma, where literally trauma from our parents, our lineage, our ancestors, our grandparents, whatever, actually can pass down into us. And it's in the maybe the genetic code or whatever you want to call it. Talk about that for a minute.
Right, that's right. And that's become much more known now. Part of that is because we now have research that shows that genetically that PTSD symptoms can be passed from generation to generation without knowing about it. So that, for instance, the research, there was some of that was done with plants, but there's also done with Holocaust survivors, how those symptoms passed down through at least three generations, and that was the most as far as they went. So, what that means is we can be impacted by what I think of as like ghosts of the past because it's not in our conscious awareness. So, generational trauma, because it's not consciously been lived or known necessarily, it makes us a little crazy when we react to something and have no idea why. Why is this, triggering me? It's like I don't have a memory of myself responding, but that doesn't mean that the generational experience hasn't had those kinds of experiences. And in RIM, we do a lot of intergenerational healing, trauma healing. And it's amazing what is within the unconscious that can be retrieved, going back to wars and all of these times when people just didn't feel resourced, they didn't have resources, and so they just were in survival crisis mode all the time.
Yeah, I read something about in the Netherlands after during World War II when the Germans came in, they burned all the wheat fields and all the food sources, and how 3 generations later, people's bodies were still responding to this lack of nutrition that their grandparents had experienced, and how it was affecting their ability to eat, what they wanted to eat, their diet, their weight. It was quite astounding, and yet it's fixable. Yeah, I've heard you talk about the term like it's a trauma can be like a ticking time bomb just waiting to be triggered. And when it's triggered, it seems like totally out of proportion. And like, but that's a good sign that we as counselors, coaches, trainers can recognize this and work with it. So let's talk about that.
So yeah, so there are a bunch of signs that there is trauma somewhere that is setting us off. So I'm just going to go through the list of them.
Sure, go ahead.
So there's anxiety. Anxiety is a very common one in our culture, and one of the issues with anxiety is this, it's not related to a specific thing always, and so you just feel anxious about, you don't know what, you just feel anxious, and that can be one of them. Depression, procrastination can, particularly that we're procrastinating against something that may be scary to us or remind us of that old feeling, being afraid that that old feeling will get stirred up again. Any kind of numbing behavior, so like overuse of alcohol, food, like eating, work, anything that we're really overdoing excessively is usually a response, a trauma response. Anger, intense bursts of anger without, as you just mentioned, out of appropriate relationship to the issue. Like I remember we had somebody who was at an in-person event and just lost it because there was no decaf coffee. It's like, really? But that means there's something buried under that. It doesn't mean it's about the coffee, but it's that some kind of feeling probably of being denied of what you need or what you want or like. It's, again, it's resurrecting that old feeling. And then if there is overdone guilt, shame, or despair, that's usually also an indication that there's been some kind of experiences. Now, again, it's, as you mentioned, it's in the exaggeration. So all these things are in the appropriate amount are normal. It's in the exaggeration of the amount of these feelings and these symptoms, these signs, so that it's sudden, it's unexpected, and it's an outburst all of a sudden. That is an indication usually that it's linked underground, unconsciously, to some kind of a traumatic experience. And then excessive self sabotage also usually, is a sign that there's been some kind of trauma. And, I think that I just am realizing as we're talking about it, that it's so easy. In the past, I think we thought trauma was child abuse. That was trauma, and we're really used to discounting very distressing, hurtful events that they're not really trauma. But it's not about what it is; it's about the kind of impact it has on you in that moment. I remember there was a woman that I was working with who had a lot of trouble dating and finding a husband, and had never, really had never really dated much. And when we went back through with REM to the moment that started, it was in fifth grade when the fifth grade boy, she was standing in the cafeteria line, and a fifth grade boy walked up to her and said, "You're ugly." Well, if you've been around fifth grade boys and girls, that's not like an unusual thing. But in that moment, because she was so concerned about how she looked, she was so vulnerable in that moment, that it was like an arrow to her heart. and she was holding back tears. She wanted to crawl under the table, and it had anchored in her body that she was not attractive to boys. And of course, when she did the work, she found out that he did it because he liked her, which also is not unusual in the fifth grade. But, it was not at all the truth. But it didn't matter whether he really felt that way or not. It was her experience of it that became a trauma that limited her ability to develop a relationship.
Hmm. Now I'm remembering a trainer event one night where someone had dropped out of the program, and but he showed up at the hotel, and one of the participants saw him in the lobby and didn't know why he wasn't still in the training. And she came in,
Yeah.
like she was anxious, she was hyperventilating, she was crying, and it was like, okay, what's going on here? And
Yeah.
when we worked with that, it turned out that she had had an experience with her mother and her sister where she couldn't, they were fighting each other, and she couldn't resolve it, and she felt totally unsafe.
Hmm.
Somehow this guy coming back after he dropped out and he was a little bit angry and all this, she couldn't resolve it, and she literally was having a traumatic trigger. And fortunately we were able to work with it, but it's those kind of things where it's so out of proportion that you
Hmm.
are able to go, okay, something's going on here. It's way more than just
Right.
curiosity or missing somebody or whatever.
That's
So 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 we've got these signs. We know that people are over responding, if you will, to out of proportion to what's going on. And so we see this in a training session, or we're working with an individual or in the group. What should people do at that point?
Well, one thing that we need to be able to do as coaches and trainers is be able to go deep with them,
Hmm.
because that's where the trauma is. So, the surface, if we react to the surface experience, we could even get trauma, triggered, because it's like they're reacting so intensely. Geez, it's like, what do I do here? This feels like a crisis. And so, the first thing is to really be able to calm ourselves so that we can be with them in a space and begin to create safety, like emotional safety, that they can be themselves, they can have them feelings, and we're not going to judge them. The first thing that we can do is to listen to what they have to say, and patiently and in a safe way, and allow them to talk, because when they talk, they're going to be beginning to, in that venting, they're letting air out of the balloon, which allows them to calm down. And that will be there helping them ground back into their body. Because when people get really, really triggered, they're really disassociated, they're out of their body. It's like they're just in their head, in a crisis mode. They're just acting out, so to speak, their feelings in that moment. And so, in order to create some boundaries of safety, we want to be very compassionate, very respectful. In room, we call it shared power. So that if we try to control somebody who's triggered, it's going to feel like we're trying to control them. And that can trigger them more, if because control is frequently an issue with trauma. Having an overzealous need to control everything can be a sign, actually, of it having a trauma related. We want to help ground them back into their body, help them feel safe, and then begin to talk about, well, what just happened, to
Let me
kind of
interrupt
gain.
you for a second. When you say ground them back into their body, can
Mhm.
you tell what you mean by that? How
Yeah,
would you
I
do
would say that the very fastest way to ground somebody back in their body is to help them breathe, and you breathe with them,
it? Hmm.
so that you're not, again, not trying to control them, but like, okay, let's take some deep breaths here together. Let's breathe into 1, 2, 3, 4. To control the breath is an indirect way neurologically to control the fear center, to calm the fear center,
Hmm.
because it begins to, all of a sudden, the involuntary part of the nervous system which also controls automatic breathing. When we start to control the breath, then we have some control there
Okay.
that we actually can help calm people down. But again, it's always in the how we do it. So if we do it in a way that is diminishing of them, we're going to get them more riled up. We're going to, what do you call it, trigger them more. But in doing it in a way of shared power, like this is a safe place. We're going to figure this out together. We're going to somehow we're going to figure out what needs to happen in this moment for you to feel better, so
Okay.
that they're not alone. For one thing, the other thing is they're not alone. And so, yeah, so those, I would say those are immediate responses. And eventually, trauma, as we talked about earlier, trauma is not going to dissolve until the work is done of dissolving the original trauma reaction. And so, learning some ways to do that is very important, if to really take your clients further so that they actually can move through their blocks. And you've done that kind of work, I've done that kind of work, and your students and my students have learned how to do that, to go deep, and work with the very deepest traumas, because that can be very scary. It can be very scary for somebody. I like, one of the things I find in the REM Institute that is the greatest work of students is to become comfortable with the kind of traumas that have happened. And when I say comfortable, I don't mean okay with them, but not getting triggered. uh, and one of the things that I've learned by doing this kind of work, a lot of this kind of work, is that triggered people trigger people.
Right.
Even the teachers. So I think it's so important to remember that keeping a handle on our own triggering and doing all the personal work that we need to do, so that we have fewer and fewer triggers, fewer and fewer traumas that are buried, is so important. And I know you do that in your classes, and so do I.
Yeah. Well, one of the things I'm taking away from this is when someone's triggered, they feel unsafe
Hmm.
and helpless in a sense, and know what to do and freeze or want to run away or whatever. And then, so we're helping them get back in their body through the breathing. We're making them feel safe by being there with them, having that confidence we're going to get through this, communicating that. So then what?
Well, I think this is the place where, uh, to be a really good coach and a really good trainer, is that you learn ways to help clients dissolve their the energy that is stuck, so that that's really, really important, I think, to figure that out, how to do that. And I think that right now it's such a tough time, since the pandemic. People have gotten so triggered. uh, all of their triggers showed up a lot of triggers showed up during the pandemic, and then now with the war in Ukraine and the Middle East, there's increasing political divisiveness and economic stress. And one of the things that's really happening is, with climate change and all of this, is that the world is changing, and it's unknown how it's going to change. And that really stirs up anxiety and fear, and that we're going to somehow be left behind, or we won't know how to deal with it. Again, the helplessness. So that learning to process that helplessness is just so important.
I agree. So, well, first of all, you're a master at this. I really appreciate your work in doing that, and it's helped me a lot and a lot of our students.